2020, USIP ran its first competition solely dedicated to environment, conflict, and peace building, funding research that touches on nearly 24 countries across Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. USIP also took steps to create a new climate, environment, and conflict program that's headquartered in Washington, D.C., but works with many of our field offices in conflict zones around the world. Many of those new grantees are presenting their USIP grant-funded work at this conference. Hopefully you've had a chance to see some of them. That includes our panelists that we have here today. Their research project looks at the process of traumatic decarbonization and examines how decarbonization will affect peace processes and political settlements in fragile oil-producing states. So we have 3 presentations and an open Q&A. The first one up will be Alex Duval. He'll give more of an overview where the broader political currents and decarbonization merge. He's the executive director of the World Peace Foundation, research professor at Tufts University's Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and a professorial fellow at the London School of Economics. He has worked on the Horn of Africa and on humanitarian issues since the 1980s as a researcher and practitioner, with a special focus on famine and humanitarian crises. Next we'll have Ben Spatz. He'll give a presentation on more on the project itself, a case-focused briefing. He's a fellow at the World Peace Foundation at Tufts University's Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. He is a scholar practitioner focused on conflict, sanctions, corruption, and African politics. And finally, we'll have Shala Al-Kli. She'll give a presentation on the Iraq case study, so we can really go in depth on Iraq. She's a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute. She's a long-term practitioner in the Middle East on issues of politics, governance, security, state building, and fragile states. So after those presentations, we'll open it up for a Q&A. We do want this to be a free-flowing conversation, so hopefully we can get some people off mute with their cameras turned on for some of the discussion and questions. But if you have any questions as we're going on, just pop it in the chat. I'll be looking at the chat the whole time and can mark some questions that we can get into later. So with that, I'll turn it over to Alex.
So thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you virtually. It's a shame that we are not all there in person. So let me start off by giving a few remarks about the overall analytical framework that we have been using for this project, which we call the political marketplace. And so I'll provide that, and then Ben will and Shahla will dive into the specifics of how this relates to the issue of hydrocarbon rents. So many of us who are interested in public policy, in economic, political, social reform, conflict resolution, peacemaking, etc., we struggle with the gap between expert analysis and action and implementation. And how often is it when we are at a more policy-oriented conference, we hear an appeal for political will or leadership, or we hear a lament that political will or leadership are lacking. And from our point of view, that's a bit of an analytical cop-out. What we're interested in is that analytical gap. What we're trying to do with the political marketplace framework is to dive into that gap and to ask, how do we make sense of what we call real politics? Now, real politics are the everyday politics that are covered by political journalists, the bargaining, the coercion, the threats, the intimidation, the alliance building, all these activities that go on a day-to-day basis, which big picture public policy makers and political scientists tend to screen out as background noise. We're not interested in that. We are interested in that. We are interested in making sense of that real politics and then how that relates to these bigger issues of public policy and the political science of how states function or dysfunction. And so there's several key points that I just want to touch on to help us, to guide us through the discussion. The first is a distinction between transactional politics versus institutional politics. So institutional politics are those that are governed by the norms, the principles, the regulations of formal state institutions, bureaucratic institutions, and so on. Transactional politics is that dealing, that everyday wheeling and dealing. And in some states, including the fragile states that we deal with, transactional politics trumps institutional politics. And as you may have guessed from my choice of verb, I think that we are also seeing transactional politics taking over in a number of states like the United States as well. So transactional politics comes down to really two elements, coercion and bribery. And Ben calls them in the Liberian vernacular, violence and cash violence. Giving a bribe is a transaction of cash violence. Coercion, I think we understand. Bribery and corruption, we need to delve a little bit deeper, because there's a lot of interest in recent years in corruption. But most analysis of corruption takes corruption as the pursuit of individual material gain by a corrupt official against the wishes of the political principle concerned. So that the government, the head of state, those in executive power don't want their underlings to be corrupt, but corrupt individuals are abusing public office for private gain. We see this more broadly. We see political corruption as being when the entire system is run on the basis of rewarding one's political followers with material incentives and with the ability of they themselves to build up their political constituencies using these material means. So spending on corruption, on patronage, on buying political goods and services, this is political spend. So the first key concept in the political marketplace framework, which is a systematization of, if you like, political corruption, along with coercion, is the idea of the political budget. Now, I came to the political budget in my work in Sudanese peace processes, because the Sudanese political operators refer to this very explicitly and openly. They say any political operator needs that political money to spend on goods, services, rewards, etc., for his, and they're almost all men, his followers. In different countries, they have different terminology. And they also analyze this in terms of a market. The price of those political goods and services, especially the price of loyalty, may rise and fall, depending on who's in the market buying. What is the structure of the market? Is it free competition with many different operators? Is it regulated? Is it a regulated oligopoly with several major players regulating the price of loyalty and controlling the transactions? So these are the key concepts there that are drawn from the systematic analysis of how countries like Sudan, South Sudan, this is the place I did my initial research, how they function. But more than that, it's also a reflection of the political vernacular and political understanding used by political operators in these countries themselves. They all recognize it immediately when you start talking in these terms. Now, when we get to peace and to oil-producing countries, two things jump out, and particularly the intersection of the two. The first is that hydrocarbon revenues are an ideal source of political spending, because the large amounts of money can be accessed centrally with very little accountability. And so what we tend to see is that countries that have a high level of dependence on hydrocarbons, or indeed other comparable minerals, have a particular rentier structure of how the political market and the political economy functions. The second point being that this becomes very crucial in peace processes. And I was involved in Sudanese and South Sudanese peace processes, and a great deal of the political bargaining behind the scenes and sometimes at the conference table itself was over distributing these oil rents. And as the oil rents were increasing, it was possible to bring people into the tent and for them to get their share of the pie and be satisfied. And so one of the questions that we wanted to pose in this study was, what happens when those rents are decreasing? If the model of peacemaking that we have been working with is premised on increasing availability of money for national budgets, but also for private political budgets, what happens when that money is less available? Let me leave it there and hand over to Ben.
Wonderful, great. All right, folks, and good morning or good afternoon. Let me try to share my screen. So I have a few slides for us. Let's see if this can work. Not quite. How's that? All right. Okay, so I'm going to essentially move this conversation more in the direction of where we took that background that Alex laid out in terms of our theoretical framework and our approach, and try to really go into the actual project. But first, let's just, one way to encapsulate all of that framing is that there are some things that we know, and then there's some things that we were trying to figure out. And we do know that there's the logic of this political marketplace. We've seen that in a number of different countries. We've studied it, and it is where this deal framework, these deals dominate these formal institutions. So again, we know also that political budgets are core to these systems. It's that central element of the bargaining. And we also know that hydrocarbon rents are key for political budgets. Okay, and again, the hydrocarbon rents are not only central to national economies, but again, and that's the way that many analysts and viewers of these types of issues understand hydrocarbon rents as being key to the overall economy, but they're essentially key to provide discretionary funds that are needed by politicians to distribute patronage, secure loyalty, retain power, and do all of the things that Alex was describing in terms of the real politics, the daily tactical maneuvering in these types of systems. So with that, that's the way that we then structured our research questions for this project. And essentially there are three. And the first is, we had to determine what are the role of these resources in these various types of agreements. What's actually happening? And we had some thoughts, let's say, about what we assumed was going to be happening given our theoretical framework, but we first wanted to understand what actually is happening. So we picked a number of countries to determine that. Then we were trying to say, like, well, what happens then in these cases when countries experience what we call traumatic decarbonization? Now, traumatic decarbonization is the massive unplanned reduction in revenue from oil and or hydrocarbons. And what we're doing there by looking at traumatic decarbonization is we're able to hopefully get a little bit of an insight into what will happen for the future of a low carbon economy or a green energy economy in the future. And the reason for that is, of course, we don't know precisely when or what will happen when we move away from hydrocarbons, but it'll happen at some point, little by little. And as we're moving there, we can look backwards to see what was happening with the traumatic decarbonization. Just to put a very fine point on that, of course, too, what that means is, basically two things. There are a number of countries, South Sudan is the prime example, where they intentionally turned off their oil production, decreasing that type of revenue. And all of a sudden that then is a proxy for seeing how the future might be without that revenue source. And the other side of that is just over the past few years when oil prices plummeted, that has a similar effect. All of a sudden, the rents that were planned relating to hydrocarbons just fell through the floor. And so that was, in essence, a way, a proxy to look at these traumatic decarbonization processes. The final research question is then to apply that to what would happen in the future and to try to understand what that would look like and what it would mean for these various pathways that are then planned for a low carbon future. Okay, so how did we do this actually? Well, we looked at a number of cases where these things were already happening, and it's the 6 cases outlined right there. And we had tremendous researchers who were able to focus on the granular, real politics of what's happening in these cases. From those cases, from that case universe, and I should say, of course, we're going to hear in depth about one, which is going to be great from Shala. We pulled from those cases a certain type of thematic oriented work, and around a number of different issues, around what were the elite bargaining dynamics, what was actually happening with that real politics, what was the way that these elite maneuvered when dramatic decarbonization happened in that case. And we tried to pull elements out from that were common across cases, but many differences also, and trying to understand what that means and put it into context. We also looked at peace agreements and peace processes more broadly. And I'll get into one slide there. And in let's say the big question is to also then try to understand, well, from these cases, what can we try to understand about political and economic transitions? The move away from hydrocarbons would be, a massive change in the global economy, and it would fundamentally change the bases of political finance in these countries, or in the world, really. And so we were trying to understand, like, what types of forecasting, what types of potential risks and opportunities could we see based on these cases. And at this point, I absolutely just need to highlight the tremendous team that we have. And also, it's great to see that Jeremy is here, because not only is he the chair of this panel, but has also been a great partner with the folks at USIP, also Tegan Blaine. But these are the researchers without whom we can't do any of this. And these are the folks who also focused on the cases and the cross-cutting work. So with this, and based on the research that these folks have done, we see a few things. We see, first of all, a certain type of political disruption. When there is dramatic decarbonization, we immediately see certain types of elite bargaining dynamics that change. There's the elite deals, the pacts, what we sometimes call carbon compacts, because it's the oil money that papers over divisions, or it can be used for certain types of these transactions that otherwise would paper over divisions that might break out into conflict. We see disruption. We see the deals break down. We see the elite scrambling. Reconfigurations of politics happen across all of the cases. And what that looks like in practice is often a tactical substitution, because these budgets and the need for money in these systems is so central that those in charge, or those with the need to pay off allies and competitors, will then quickly look for a substitution avenues. They need money somewhere. And what that might mean is context specific, but we do see across every case that there are moves towards some other type of good that can bring in revenue. In the case of Sudan, they move from largely focusing on oil to focusing on gold. And that change, that move from oil to gold, changed the elite political configurations in Khartoum. And our researcher focusing on that was able to, among other things, put that puzzle together such that it actually led to a broader set of destabilizing effects that ultimately did lead to Bashir being pushed out to a certain extent. It all contributed. I mean, a massive set of reconfigurations of politics. At the same time, other tactical substitutions could be simply looking for different external patrons, and that can reconfigure the global political environment. It can be renting out mercenary services to neighbors or to others, or it can be predating on local communities. And that we also saw quite a bit. There is often violence in these systems. South Sudan was a prime example of that. And I should say too, for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into each case study with great detail. I mean, we're going to do that with Iraq, which will be wonderful. But for the Q&A, we can talk about all of the cases in as much depth as you want. But just to draw out some of these main points, violence often happens. And what we can see is how these processes play out more than just in a case-by-case basis. And that means there's an implication for peace processes, which we can see right here. Now, this is a pretty, let's say, colorful graph, but I'll walk you through it. It's actually pretty simple once you understand what's going on. And this was done by our researcher, Jan Pospisil. Wonderful stuff. So what we see here essentially is, and he was able to analyze all of the peace agreements, all of the signed agreements from 1990 onwards. Now, these are signed agreements, and of course there are deals and agreements that are not signed and codified. But of the universe of peace agreements that are signed, he was able to map that onto oil revenues. And so that blue line cutting across are oil revenues going up and down over time. And the various bars going vertically are the different type of peace agreement, which he's coded with the University of Edinburgh's larger database in a number of different ways. Don't focus too much on each specific color and what those all mean, except in the following sense. Blue are ceasefires. And ceasefires, you can imagine, are these very temporary halts in violence. They're not comprehensive. They do not aim to be, and they really are, we can think of them as a cessation of hostilities, often when bargaining is still taking place. So in that period around where the dotted red box is, this is when oil revenues are going up. We see ceasefires going down, almost very, very few of them. And in fact, the more comprehensive peace agreements were being signed during that period of significant oil revenue. And then what happens as soon as the oil revenue starts dropping overall is that the complete flip takes place in terms of the types of peace agreements that we see. We see almost very few of these comprehensive peace agreements, and instead this massive increase in ceasefire agreements. And these are correlations, not causation, not a clear causal link. We can see that these two elements go together. And comparing that with the case universe and the knowledge of the case that the other researchers bring, what we believe is happening is that as the oil revenues decrease, the elite deals break down, and often this will turn into violent bargaining, as these different leaders will then try to get more of the pie. And this is something that we think really deserves more thought. So just to go back to this, again, what we see across all of these cases is elite political disruption that often has violent implications for local communities and individuals. We see this tactical maneuvering where there's always the need and to find substitutes for oil when that revenue dries up. And we see across the globe implications for peace processes that cut across geography and time. Now, what don't we see when oil revenues decrease? We do not see systemic change. We do not see that the rules of the political marketplace go away. We do not see a transition to peaceful, democratic, equitable societies. The rules of the game in these systems are durable. They are sticky. And instead, it's just this tactical changes. And so that leads to a few takeaways. And so the first, there's often a myth that all good things go together, meaning that as we move towards a green economy, as we move to tackle the problems of global climate change and try to be better caretakers of the environment, those are understood to be globally positive. that does not necessarily lead to case-specific or localized positive effects necessarily. And so you can have a positive global effect, but still have quite negative or at least very complicated effects at the local level. So there needs to be much more nuance about how those elements go together and just to think more holistically. Second, there are these massive amounts of literature and policy focus on the links between natural resources and conflict. And what our work does as a pilot project here is it essentially says, look, there's not the same kind of clear direct link between energy production and conflict. You can't say for sure that by either having oil or not having it, you're going to have conflict. That's not necessarily what's happening. Instead, what you see is that there are specific institutional arrangements, these political marketplace institutional arrangements, and specific configurations of politics. And based on those, then we can understand what the implications might be for a decarbonized or a low carbon future. So again, recognizing these particular institutional arrangements is what's key, not necessarily simply the presence or the production of oil or a mineral or anything else. And third point is what Alex was also mentioning, is this link between political finance and corruption. We really want to problematize this and highlight it. It's essential. The idea of political finance is essential, and corruption is often a means of obtaining political finance. If you think of corruption as in, individuals using public finances for non-public goods. However, again, it isn't simply corruption as personal gain. There's something else happening. And what that is really important for us to try to tease out. And we have lots of very interesting examples from the case universe on the links between political finance and corruption. So the final points here are perhaps quite straightforward given the two presentations here, but what we're trying to do with this project is it's really an agenda setting project. And the conversation between the academic and the policy communities on this issue has been relatively siloed. You have individuals who are thinking about conflict and fragile states, and those individuals are thinking about this from a certain point of view. Then you have individuals thinking about, in the scholarly community, thinking about environmental change and policy, and many other different types of policy and academic communities are thinking about these things, but they're often relatively siloed. So we're trying to bring these groups together and put together a holistic way of understanding this. And essentially what that means is by putting politics central to bringing a political lens to these issues. Because at the end of the day, and this is perhaps the largest, most important takeaway, is that these issues are not technical and they're political at their very heart. What do I mean by that? Well, again, if you think of these different silos of practice and scholarship, you have all of the technical folks who are, looking at agreements and standards and protocols and metrics and benchmarks and all of the implementation that needs to move for a 2-degree goal or a 1.5 degree goal and how to reach those. It's very technical sets of conversations. Then there's the environmental and scientific community who are often thinking about, what are these effects on the environment? How do we meet these goals? What do we need to do to get there? And often politics, at least in places like the United States or the West or these large, more developed economies, the politics is often understood as a domestic political focus. So what I mean by that is, taking the case of the United States as simply one example, when you think of politics in that case, most individuals at least would say, okay, well, what are the political impacts of a particular leader, the president or Congress, moving away from a carbon-based economy? What would that impact be on local businesses? What would the impact be on the coal producers? What would the impact be ultimately on elections and the ability to get reelected? And that's a too narrow way of thinking about politics. And so what we're trying to do is, again, highlight this case universe of these fragile and conflict affected states, a twist on those really these political marketplace systems, and recognizing that many of them are central to the global oil and gas production, and their political environments are fundamentally different, and that needs to be understood. And I know that we have a fair bit of time to discuss all this in the Q&A, and in particular, we're going to be able to hear from Shala about one of these fascinating cases. And with that, I will turn over to her right now.
Thank you very much, Ben and Alex, for this overview. And actually, it's going to help me a lot in terms of trying to explain some complexities and new trends in Iraqi politics in the lieu and within the framework that we just heard from you and Alex. So thank you so much for helping me decoin some of the complexes of Iraq. Iraq, obviously, it's a country with a huge carbon potential. At the same time, it's an excellent example of a rentier state that more than 90% of its revenues just come from oil, specifically after 2003 and the developments in the countries, which basically all other sectors, non-oil sectors, has been fading out, and though they are trying to picking up nowadays, but oil revenue makes a cornerstone of Iraqi state budget. So first, I would like to explain the concept of decarbonization, how it's reflected in Iraq. When we talk or I explain the Iraq case, decarbonization in Iraq doesn't mean that Iraqi government has a policy of shifting to renewable energy or something like this. Actually, decarbonization in Iraq is reflected in terms of the plummeting of the oil prices and the volatile oil market that have started between 2016. Glimpses of it started 2015, very volatile 2016 onward, going through the COVID pandemic and up to date, actually. Till this moment, as of today, Iraq needs the prices of oil to reach $120 per barrel in order just to balance its budget, which actually, if we look at the oil prices, it ranges from $30 to $87 or $85 per barrel nowadays. So obviously there is a huge deficit in Iraqi state budget. Now let's step back and see how this plummeting of the oil prices, decarbonization, global decarbonization reflected in plummeting oil prices, how all these dynamics are reflected in Iraq. Definitely, it affected Iraq from social, political, and economic point of view, in addition to a very important factor in Iraqi politics, which is the regional intervention, the dynamics of the regional intervention. I would argue that the majority of the dynamics or the factors emerging in Iraqi case, for majority part of it, for the long term, it's very positive. It's very positive because it led into a shift into in the rent mind or rentier mind within the population, which enabled and planted seeds for a youth movement that's been reflected in massive demonstrations, 2016, 17, 18, sporadic demonstration, to the culmination of all these factors that enabled the youth movement having huge public demonstrations in 2019, leading to the resign of the prime minister, having early elections, October 2021, and now we are in a government formation process. But if we compare the government formation process, the political marketplace of Iraq 2022 to the one in 2018, we see huge differences. Number one, the political marketplace is not only about the oil revenue, the employment of the public, which always fed political parties to enlarge its patronage. And the only solution for anything, unemployment, dissatisfaction with government and civil services, it was the only solution, the easiest solution for all political parties is to hire more people into the public sector. And that's why the public sector nowadays swelled to the extent that it makes up for 45% of the Iraqi budget. But since 2018, I would say 19, Iraqi government or the political parties within this Iraqi political process, they are unable to hire more people. Simply, everything is drying out. Salaries, for the first time in Iraq, it's been delayed several months or kind of several weeks in Baghdad and Kurdistan region for several months. So what does that mean into the political marketplace or marketization of government spoils within political parties? How does that affect the militias and the Iranian political and militarized proxies in Iraq, which at the end of the day, how all that have shifted Iraqi politics from pure sectarianism, muhassasa ta'ifiyya, which means government approachment, which is basically you distribute the government spoils according to the sect and the way within the political parties based on sectarian issue, sectarian determinations. All this have shifted muhassasa ta'ifiyya into muhassasa al-hizbiyya, which means the spoils nowadays are shifted to be distributed according to the political parties' strength. It's not linear, it's not the final step. This optimistic look into Iraq political process doesn't mean that this government formation process will yield a government that's more democratic, more representative of Iraqi politics. But what we have in this government formation in 2022, it's a shift from just pure sectarian consideration. It's a clear shift into how the government provides services in the south or in Kurdistan or in the West. So that's in terms of the political marketplace. All these political parties having the state budget drying out, they started to find other venues, other sectors in order to pay for their political bargaining. The major venues and sectors are border crossings with Iran, with Saudi Arabia, with Jordan, with Turkey, which that lead into a more trade-based mentality in terms of how you control these border crossing rather than militia mentality. So that also has a huge shift into how the youth movement in Iraq has been able to flourish. What I'm trying to say here is that as the state drying out its easy money to fund some militias, some political parties' patronage, this openness and this inability of political parties to go for this easy money has opened the door for some youth movement to flourish and then take the Iraqi politics from pure sectarianism into a more political consideration and government service delivery aspects for the population. Now, given this context, are we saying that this election is the final step in the democratization process in Iraq? Definitely no. I think it needs 2 more elections in order to start the first step to move away from a complete frontier state, a complete frontier mentality, over use of political marketplace concept or marketization of Iraqi government position into a more politics, rather than being a proxy for Iran or Saudi Arabia. You are going inward into the domestic politics of Iraq, and that's what we are seeing nowadays. One final point here. The decarbonization, as they are a global dynamic reflected in general in the Middle East for all other rentier states. In Iraq case, the most two states that we are concerned with are Iran and Saudi Arabia. As decarbonization, plummeting of the oil prices affected the domestic politics within Iraq, shifted these dynamics, opened the door for more political and social civicness within the Iraqi politics. It also affected Iran's capability to wield power within Iraqi politics, to fund more militia. Of course, in the case of Iraq, in addition to the plummeting of the oil prices, also the American sanctions curtailed Iran's ability to continue funding these militias. What does that mean for Iraqis? It means that the Iranians now are shifting into dealing with the government in terms of getting more contracts or paying for the electricity or the gas that we're importing, instead of paying for the militias to go and have a political political proxies within Iraqi parliament and military proxies fighting the wars in Syria and on the border. For Saudi Arabia, of course, it completely shifts the mindset of Saudis in Iraq. Instead of shutting Iraqi government away because oil was enough for Saudi Arabia, or even contributing to some extremist factors in Iraq, nowadays Saudi Arabia and Iraq relation is based on investment, business, trying to open more doors for Saudi companies. As the Saudis themselves, they have a vision for 2030 and moving away from a rentier state. So I think to conclude, I would say that what in the Iraqi case, what's the outcomes or the takeaways from Iraqi case is that decarbonization, it's reflected in each rentier state in different aspects of decarbonization. We are not talking about a more mature climate consideration in Iraq. We are just talking about a mere tactical, if we call it, aspect, which is the plummeting of the oil prices. As the plummeting of the oil prices affects the inward, the domestic politics within Iraq, opens some doors for a youth movement and moving away from sectarian considerations. Also, it affects the regional factors that affect Iraqi politics, which is Iran and Saudi Arabia. Definitely, if we go higher than that, it also affected how the United States' presence in Iraq. It's been a little bit, I would say, more limited than all in, because the United States itself has a very, let's say, relatively, if we compare it to Iraq, a very strong decarbonization approach, trying to get away from oil and all that. So that also affected the prioritization of Iraq in terms of the American foreign policy, in terms of American approach into the issues and conflicts in the Middle East. Thank you so much, and happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you to all three of our presenters. I want to turn it over now to one other member of the project team, actually Aditya Sarkar. He's with us, and it'd be great if Aditya, if you could just introduce yourself and also get the discussion started here. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeremy, and thank you for these really fantastic comments. So my name is Aditya. I am a researcher. I'm a visiting fellow at the World Peace Foundation, and I'm a researcher. I'm particularly interested in issues of labor, migration, and conflict. And I just want to keep my remarks quite brief, but I want to just touch on a couple of ideas for future research. In some senses, this research project was really meant to be an agenda setting project, an exploratory project which would sort of start or sort of explore the idea which we hadn't done before. So given that, I think I want to sort of identify a couple of points. I think the first, and I want to reiterate this, the point that Ben made about bringing the different silos of research together, I can't emphasize that enough. I mean, it's very clear that different groups of researchers and policymakers use very different language and very different terms, which don't really speak to each other, although there are clearly very significant overlaps between the topics that they work on. Now, two areas of research which I think come out very clearly. I think the first is, what kind of reorganization of state-society relationships are we likely to observe in places which go through decarbonization, especially political markets? And on this, I really want to touch on the South Sudan case, which was written by Joshua Craze. And in that paper, what Joshua argued was that the oil boom in South Sudan made the political market very nakedly transactional. And in some senses, the elites were able to make themselves autonomous from the people. But the end of the oil boom meant that the political market became one where reward was essentially licensed to loot and predate, a reversion to the pre-oil boom era, if you will. But the specifics of the process of carbonization and then decarbonization has simply meant that the elite compact has become stronger. So the interclass dynamic between elites and non-elites has become more pronounced, even though elites continue to sort of contest for power and position amongst the class quite violently. And the transition here has occurred after decarbonization, because South Sudan has effectively gone through a decarbonization process. So it's not from war to peace or from oil to green futures. I mean, it's just it really is a laboratory for what might happen in similar political systems. So following on from that, I mean, really one way to examine the question is to look at the ways in which the broader political economy is organized in these countries beyond merely the elite. And this will require looking at and studying the changing political ecology of extraction and natural resource exploitation, including the ways in which these resources move and are connected to much wider supply chains. As Shala mentioned, I mean, you have roadblock politics becoming more and more important in some of these places. And I think one excellent example of this comes from the Venezuela case, where illegal mining, illegal gold mining has really sprouted in as the oil industry has collapsed. And mining and smuggling activities in Venezuela are carried out by a really fragmented network of state and non-state actors, which are both national, transnational, licit, illicit. I think the point is the line between state and non-state, between these different categories, has become quite blurred. And understanding that political economy with all its nuances, I think, quite essential. And of course, I think one last point, which is a related question, could be to look at the world of work and what happens after. I mean, one of the points that is often made, and one of the theorized benefits of the green transition, is our sort of green jobs, which will be created as a result of decarbonization. Now, these assumptions are usually more common amongst policymakers than scholars, but even then, this is not something which has been explored in length. And in the cases that we saw, we actually didn't see any kind of movement towards better jobs. In fact, we saw greater forms of land dispossession, more precarity, etc. Now, there are some scholars who are obviously already working on this, but I think bringing this kind of shift of political economies in conversation with the decarbonization agenda is likely to be quite essential. Let me stop there. Again, obviously happy to answer questions if there are any. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Aditya. And it looks like from our panel, Alex is suffering through a thunder and lightning storm at his location. So down to Ben and Shala to answer any questions you have. Please put them in the chat if you have any questions for the panelists. I can go ahead and use the chair privilege, unless Ben, did you want to add something there?
Just getting ready. I've always got lots to add.
Oh.
Happy to start with you and others too. I think that, yeah, of course, this will work best if it's a conversation among those of us in this virtual room. So no, I'm just ready. Go for it, Jeremy. Thanks.
Well, looks like Carl has a question for the panel. So why don't you take yourself off mute?
Thank you. I would like to thank the panelists for a terrifying discussion. I see you're very convincing, both in theory and in examples. The question that I have is there anything that can be done? Is there any cause for optimism? I think you've done a good job of outlining or laying out the problematique, but if we're trying to have a dramatic, rapid, and I think the rapid's part of the problem, transition that's going to affect economies, and not just internationally, but also look at what's happening in West Virginia. Rapid transition. Is there any precedent for any of the solutions you might propose? Is particularly at the scale of national economies needing to go through a change in the primary source of revenue in the space of 20 or 30, 40 years?
Yeah, tremendously important question. Essentially, that is the question, isn't it? And trying to understand what we do. What I'd like to do is defer to the others on the panel first. So yeah, Shala, Aditya, if you all would like to take a stab at this, and then I'll do whatever I can afterwards. Shala, yeah, I see your yellow hand is up.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And it's really a very important question, because it's the questions that if I look at the Iraq case, I would say it's the question that will impact to sustain the positive aspects of this transition and transformation process in Iraq, or it will be just a phenomena that will die out. And what I mean by this, as I mentioned, the plummeting of the oil prices open doors for two important dynamics: civil society, youth movement, and holding the government accountable for civil services, security, stability, all these issues, instead of just sectarian rhetoric, which affected the political parties in order to reinvent themselves and show themselves and base their politics on citizen politics instead of sectarianism. The second is that in Iraq, for the first time, I see a flourishing of small businesses, specifically among women and young people. Very interesting dynamics that are emerging in the Iraqi economy. That's the economy of the geek jobs, IT, and also using the social media. These two dynamics, these are the smaller, the very granular aspects, social trends within Iraqi politics or the society, need stabilization because they are so nascent nowadays, need support from global community, for example, if we talk about the United States, in order to sustain the development of what I call them homegrown private sector, instead of the private sector that are masks for other political parties. Homegrown political activism, homegrown small businesses. So, and we are seeing some glimpses of that in Iraq, but by the fact that we have number of entrepreneurial hubs that are flourishing in, for example, Nineveh, in Kurdistan region, in Anbar, in Basra, in areas that you wouldn't think that we could have such potential. And there is this trend of matchmaking between local small companies in Iraq with regional or even global. So I think just tip the scale for the civil society and the youth movement through empowering, through programs for small businesses. That's the first thing come to mind. The second thing is that how you can have, because I work in USAID programs, in international development, how you can increase these types of programs that empower and transfer the know-how of renewable energy, climate oriented policies, and we have a huge impact in the southern part of Iraq. How you empower the government, how you empower factions within even the local government on a provincial level to take care or have a climate consideration in terms of their dealing with the big oil companies. that we see that the number of diseases are increasing in the southern part of Iraq. So what can the international community do in order to support these government or governance policies, which at the end of the day led into better services and all that? Thank you so much for the question. I'm very enthusiastic about it. These are the major things come to mind when we talk about what we need from the international community in order to sustain the positive aspects of this dynamic.
Great, thank you, Shala. Aditya?
Yeah, thanks. Again, fantastic question. And I think this is something we come across quite often when we're talking about the political marketplace. It's quite a dystopian kind of vision of the world. But I mean, the way I think we always like to approach the political marketplace is that understanding the system for what it is necessary for transforming the system. And I think there are some decent examples, including in one of the research papers. Now, I'm not an expert, so I won't try and speak to the research paper at length. This is the one on Venezuela and Ecuador. But there are both those countries followed very divergent paths. And what I think the authors argued in that paper really was that the oil crisis hit both Venezuela and Ecuador quite hard. And even Ecuador turned towards sort of expansion of other kinds of extractive activities, but did so in a far more institutionalized way. And in fact, the difference between Venezuela and Ecuador and the divergent paths they took in terms of political evolution was really to do with the cohesion of the ruling party and the reach of the military coercive apparatus in these states. In Ecuador, the cohesion of the ruling party was not quite as cohesive. The left-wing side of the party, the indigenous movement, the feminist movement were quite strong and quite successfully sort of pressured Korea to not seek re-election, whereas this was not obviously the case in Venezuela. And I think that's quite a key and interesting point. Again, it builds on what Shala was saying. I think it is really civil society, popular pressure, which kind of tends to move the system and move the needle. A second point which I want to make is that the effects of these transformations are not always linear. Now, if you take the case of Sudan, what you see is that gold mining, which expanded massively after Sudan lost its oil fields with the secession of South Sudan, doesn't employ the same people as the oil extractive industry did. It's completely different. The people who are moving into gold mining are the people who are moving from agriculture. Now, we don't quite know the impacts of this yet, simply because Sudan is a country where there's been a long history of ruling elites extracting profits from a non-productive agricultural sector, largely because of a labor surplus, which is not something that's playing out any longer because people are moving towards gold, leaving agriculture. So how does that affect the political system? I don't think we're quite clear yet. The rules are likely to be sticky, but there will be changes which are quite unpredictable. That's just to underline the sort of non-linear nature of sort of cause and effect in these cases. Over.
Yeah, I've got a few thoughts too that are important here. Really reiterating and sort of repackaging some of the things that have already been said. But again, Carl, this is really the question, and there is no easy answer, because to your question about, is there a precedent? I think the answer is no. I mean, this would be a fundamental change, and there's no precedent that I know of in the modern world where there has been such a rapid decrease in political finance, essentially overnight. Again, when you have South Sudan, Iraq, with 90% plus of their budget comes from hydrocarbons, or Nigeria, where the numbers are harder to gauge, but can be at least upwards of 80% of the national budget comes from these things, all of a sudden gone overnight. I mean, we haven't seen that. So that's kind of new territory and potentially is scary. But as Aditya said, the essential thing here to do is to just focus on what's actually happening. That's the first order of business, is to not necessarily be, I mean, we don't call it dystopian. We don't think it's negative or pessimistic. We think it's a clear-eyed assessment of actually how these places function. And to recognize the logic, the political logic of those systems is the first order of business. And then from that, from that accurate analysis, you can begin trying to understand what the implications would be. So you just have to take the world as it actually is now, not as we hope it to be in the future. And politics is at the center of that. That's the real thrust of the work. So two other points related here is, one, the specific configurations of politics. You know, what Shala is explaining in Iraq and what Aditya brought out in a couple of the cases that he's more familiar with and has been working on. I mean, these are all different. They're all case specific, but you can come up with some higher level general comments. And that's what I was trying to do. Essentially, that means that, look, the tactics are always going to change. There often will be different, but the actors will search for other sources of revenue. And in almost all cases, it'll be a path of least resistance. So what will be the easiest way to patch these holes in revenue? Now, there's no easy answer if that ends up being, you know, that violent predation is going to be the easiest path. But here's what people can do. And here's what I think the best country analysts and context experts know, is these people know what will be the path of least resistance. They know what other types of revenue sources, either whether it's minerals or renting out militias or, you know, relying on external patrons, they'll kind of know these political dynamics and be able to say and plan out different likely, most likely, less likely type scenarios of saying, these are the things that are probably likely to happen. We don't know for certain, but these are the things. So country experts know this. They can kind of plot this out decently. And making sure that they're able to be brought into the conversation, you know, in relation to what we're talking about, trying to collapse a lot of these silos, is really important. Now, the final part of this is, well, okay, what can other external folks do to plan or mitigate or avoid traumatic decarbonization? Well, the first thing is, it doesn't have to be traumatic. The traumatic part is the massive unplanned move away from hydrocarbon rents. So the first part is, I mean, if it's not unplanned, if it's understood, if people recognize that this is going to happen, then there can be a bit more of a pathway that could potentially be a little bit smoother. What are some things that people could do? And I will certainly, you know, in this, value the thoughts of the others in this room here to have ideas and examples too. But for example, if there's an extremely violent country context, or if it's not violent, there's a history of violence that perhaps has been papered over through large oil rents that have been passed around, keeping a lid on violence at the moment. But people will know that these are violent systems. And then you can expect that if the revenues dry up, there might be violence again. So you can kind of think and again, plan for the future in those kinds of contexts. If the context instead is one where there is a different type of, for lack of a more precise word, meddling of neighbors or international actors, then you sort of know that those configurations might change and what that might mean for local dynamics. Or if the context is institutionally weak, you know, and again, that's the Venezuela-Ecuador comparison. It's fascinating. I mean, you have very different institutional arrangements in these types of contexts. And when the institutions are stronger, when there is more participation and a different type of strength in the formal sector, then you do see better outcomes ultimately. Now, of course, to that last point, the idea of how to actually build true, strong formal institutions, that's a nut that no one has been able to crack yet. But we do see, again, you can take the system as it is and recognize that certain paths are more or less likely. And I think that's at least the starting point.
Great, thank you for that. We did have one question in the comments, more general, what can the international community do to avoid the traumatic decarbonization? We kind of touched on that, but I want to build on it a little bit more, asking specifically about anti-corruption measures, which I know some of you on the panel have experience working with. it was interesting how some of the countries in your case study examples, they when they're decarbonized, they pivoted to another natural resource, such as Sudan, just kind of moving into gold. Whereas others moved into a kind of a different form of corruption, like Nigeria and South Sudan, the contractocracy, as it was said, or in South Sudan, moving towards the predation on licenses and land reform as a way to still gain those cuts of money to move to essentially change it into political money. How does that kind of interact with all these global compacts on anti-corruption, all the international laws, various policies that different countries, regional organizations have on this? I mean, is any of that kind of effective in cutting into this? Is that something that could be pursued more? I'm just kind of curious on your thoughts on that.
Again, yeah, great question. I will still defer to Shala and Aditya first.
Ben, you're the real expert on this one.
Thank you. I'm thinking of the situation in Iraq and what has been shifted in Iraqi politics in terms of corruption or corrupted deals. As I mentioned before, it was easy money coming from oil, contracting your own masks as a political party, your own masked, supposedly private sector company, and we move on. But nowadays, I think the plummeting of the oil prices also contributed to another type of corruption, but at the same time, for the lack of a better word, it's more mitigating the conflict. It's more taking things out of the control of the militias. Here is what. The plummeting of the oil prices, the enabling of the government to hire more people, led political parties to find new venues. As I mentioned, these new venues manifested in a new business elite in Iraq. They are not necessarily politically aligned with any specific political party. They are cross-sectarian, cross-ethnic group, but pure business oligarch who are lobbying, creating small lobbies within various political parties for certain end, for certain legislation, or for certain candidate to become even a prime minister, or who is going to be the minister of communication, which affects the internet and the licensing for the mobile phones. All these aspects, yes, it's very negative because we are having corruption in a different terms, but at the same time, it has some aspect of mitigated positive things there, which is taking the, I'm talking about Iraq case, taking the control of who is who from the militia into a business oligarch. In terms of what can be done in terms strengthening the anti-corruption policies, I think in Iraq case, it's very interesting dynamic that we have a quite diverse set of media outlets. Every single party, whether small or big, they have their own TV, radio, all present on all types of social media. What does that mean? That means that a political party, a media owned by specific political parties competing during elections and campaigns, and even nowadays for the government formation, they are keen to unmask all the corrupted deals that the other political party is doing. That's why I would always say that we in Iraq are very politically savvy as in terms of public. We know who is who. We have leaked documents and contracts among big names within Iraqi political system. So that's by itself, the openness of the media to that extent, even sometimes leaking very sensitive documents from the Ministry of Defense just for political gain. But at the same time, by itself, it raised awareness among Iraqi population about corruption and all that. And I would say the public opinion started, and that's the important aspect of it, started to wield the pressure and actually to have a say and a role about how to curtail corruption and mitigate the impact of these deals. That's what comes to mind the first, if we think about what are, if I put it in, what are the trends of corruption in Iraq nowadays? I would say the strengthening of democratic institutions like media, free speech, though they are owned by several political parties, but we have like more than 20 TV political talk shows every night, each educating its population about what the other party is doing. But at the end of the day, this is open source information about all political parties, which make more political gain in terms of mitigating corruption. Thank you.
There are no easy answers when it comes to corruption. This is an age-old problem. And when you study illicit economies, when you study corrupt actors and actions, and again, what we like to reframe it, not necessarily about corruption, because that has a normative lens and it's often just focusing on individuals personally profiting. We kind of like to talk about it in terms of political finance and how money is, sucked out of the system for all of these various purposes. It's essentially like squeezing one end of a balloon. You are gonna just, the action and activity just moves somewhere else. It's really, really tough. There are some things that can be done. However, we all know that the track record of the anti-corruption work has been spotty at best. And simply having a protocol or an institution locally or internationally has not really led to an end of corrupt activity, to say the least. Again, so there needs to be more done than simply have, an anti-corruption institution on the ground. We all know this, of course. So I'll say what I think should happen, recognizing that it probably won't happen for political reasons. Now, as Shala was mentioning that, and as we've seen from other types of leaked document dumps, etc., those types of actions, which have dubious legality, again, in most cases, what they do, despite that, is they reveal what's actually happening underneath the surface and who's benefiting. And that is useful to know. That's really, really useful. Most political systems want to hide that, including many, fully developed, highly institutionalized Western countries. They're hiding ownership. This is why there are so many countries where and jurisdictions where you do not have to actually put personal ownership, and beneficiary ownership can be easily hidden through other types of companies and corporations. In an ideal world, things would be a lot easier if we knew who was behind all of these companies and corporations and who's benefiting from certain types of activity. And that, though, is almost a political non-starter to a certain extent. And yet that really is probably one of the most important things, because many of these types of, corrupt dealings, they do go through companies, they do go through businesses and certain entities, even in, again, these fragile and conflict affected states. That still happens. It's not all just bags of cash being moved around. So if there's a way to try to require public documentation of who's involved, try to require beneficiary ownership documentation, that will go a long way. At the same time, I think we all need to recognize that survey data shows from many places on the ground that when the citizenry becomes more aware, when they know that their political system is corrupt and they're confronted with that they actually become more upset and kind of move away from, let's say, their faith in a democratic political system. And unfortunately, that is proven to be true. So there's sort of, if you highlight these certain things, you're allowing activists and political actors to kind of have documentation in hand, then perhaps then even leads to legal implications for corrupt actors. And at the same time, though, that does have implications for the citizens. So it's a really tough question. And I'm happy to speak more specifically about corruption too. It is something that Aditya said I think about a fair bit, but I also want to make sure that we have some time to get some other questions in if possible.
Thank you for that, Ben. If anyone else has any questions, please put them in the chat. If not, I'm going to go ahead again. I want to go back to part of Ben's presentation. You showed that the time graph that Jan had created, combining the process of the decarbonization with other peace processes, ceasefires, etc. I recognize you said that was not exact, causation. There's, some more of a correlation. But I'm just wondering kind of about the sequencing or the time, the relationship and time between those two. In terms of what we can do, and as part of the international community, policymakers, if we think that a country is going to go through a traumatic decarbonization, how much time do we have, before another market that could be just as pernicious takes hold, right? Like how much time until they just all switch to the contractocracy or to the gold, et cetera? Is there kind of like a golden window or like, a period of opportunity where if we can recognize and see this, traumatic change about to happen, where we could really go in and make some change? Because my assumption is, if we just look at this years afterwards, the new pernicious market will have already taken hold quite strongly, and there's the longer it goes on and the more deep rooted it is, the less we can really do about it. So how can we think about timing and reaction, and in some ways prediction about which countries we think this could happen to next, or who would be undergoing these changes?
Yeah, absolutely. The time lag is not long. I mean, it happens almost in real time. And so what this is a case for, and I can kind of hear you making it obliquely and implicitly, is this is a case for preventative action and forward thinking and really pre-positioning assets and analysis and scenario planning ahead of time. I think we can see with relative clarity which countries are going to go through these types of processes. I mean, it's the group of fragile and conflict affected states that are largely reliant on hydrocarbons, or frankly, any type of significant, single significant source of revenue. It could be any other mineral as well. I mean, or any other source of income, right? So when that dries up, we know it's going to happen almost immediately, because again, the political elite actors in these systems, they can't wait a year to sort out their alliances and deals. I mean, it happens the same day, the first day. And frankly, these people are obviously they're living in these systems. They can see ahead better than we can as outsiders. So sometimes they're taken off guard, the folks inside these systems themselves. Sometimes it is completely unknown that what will happen, and the traumatic decarbonization in this case will take them by surprise. But often they're planning ahead. Often they do kind of say, well, geez, this is going to be happening pretty soon. I need to start thinking about it. So again, that's really just a case for preventative forward thinking. I think it has to happen that way. There's, of course, the main challenge here is that doesn't work on institutional timelines with, let's say, donor agencies and other governments often don't work on those kinds of timelines in terms of thinking ahead, but that's really what's needed. And so I could easily imagine, I mean, again, this was a pilot project, just trying to both test our assumptions and then see what we see in a few set of cases. And we feel really confident. I'm so proud of like the researchers that, I was giving voice to their research, but they were really doing the work, did incredible stuff. So we kind of feel confident that this is what's happening. I mean, I could imagine the next order of business is to say, okay, we can come up with a list of of countries. And I don't just mean us. I mean, most folks could come up with a list of places where these kinds of things are going to happen. From there, you can start plotting out what are different kinds of likely scenarios. Again, certain countries and contexts are violent currently or have a very violent history. Those are going to be in a different category than some others that have, a different history. And so therefore, again, you can start kind of planning what's going to happen. But if you wait, as you say, Jeremy, it's going to be too late, and you're going to be trying to send diplomats and envoys, and trying to catch up with events on the ground. It's just not going to work. I don't know if Shala or Aditya, you have other thoughts or on this? Okay.
Yeah, please add any thoughts, or if you have any final thoughts. We're basically at time here. If there's anything else you want to add, we can wrap it up.
Great. Well, Shala, Aditya, do you want to make some final one-sentence thoughts, or?
Oh, I think you've kind of captured it all quite neatly, at least all I had to say. Thanks.
If we summarize where Iraq is heading, or where we are thinking, all these changes and transformational issues that are emerged specifically in the last 3-4 years, I would say that Iraq is, in terms of politics and the political process, it's on a better track. It just started. If we take 2003 as a change, 2022 is the second wave of change. Now, how we move forward from now, it's just a planted seed. It's very nascent process. So it needs support from international community, institutional know-how, civil society, no more than these areas. Because if you go with a heavy intervention, more bold intervention, you will not yield the outcome that we are all anticipating from this homegrown processes or changes, whether politics, social, economic. And then, so I think if I want to wrap up the Iraq case, Iraq is on a better track, not linear, but on a better track within the next 2 election cycles, definitely. Thank you.
Great. Well, I'll, in 1 minute, try to, put out a thought or two here. Echo, obviously, everything that Alex said before his internet went down, and Shala and Aditya too. But essentially, when we think about it, it's not a purely hopeless scenario. I want to emphasize that. I mean, we're focusing on the problems so that we can make sure that we at least understand them, if not try to fix them. But it's not completely hopeless. But what we do really strongly make the case for, and what absolutely, crystal clear in bright, bold letters comes through from the case studies and the thematic work, is that this is a case for preventative thinking, for a slightly different kind of analysis, and for engagement, and for political engagement and understanding first and foremost. These issues are not technical solely. They are, of course, technical to a certain extent. I mean, reaching climate goals, or honestly, aren't we all fascinated when we read articles about new technology that can do certain types of things? I mean, there are technical aspects of these types of transitions, and yet we need to recognize that they're not purely technical, that politics is right at the very center of it. And I'll say that it's politics in a way that is just a little bit different than what we often think of. I mean, if we're in a Western institutionalized setting, if we're sitting in my case, in the United States, or if we're sitting in other countries, we might lull ourselves into thinking that other countries their politics works in the same way. And what we need to do is we need to think much more empathetically. Let's try to put ourselves in the situation of the individuals in those other contexts and say, well, what is happening there? What are the political constraints and opportunities that they're facing? And how can we understand them, recognize where there might be opportunities, where there might be dangers for civilians and for broader political impacts? And how do we try to bring those pieces together? So it's hopeless at all, not at all purely hopeless, but it does require a different kind of thinking, one that's really focused on the politics. So I'll leave it there and just thank everybody for joining and Jeremy, for chairing in front of the floating mountains there.
Absolutely. Thanks for everyone's thoughts and contributions today, and hope to see you at some of the other sessions on this last day. Thanks.
Absolutely, everyone.
Jeremy.